Welcome to the 10th program of the Academy of the North American Unitarian Association. My name is Stephen Palmer, and I am a member of the advisory board of the North American Unitarian Association of the Academy. Our speaker this evening is Ken Ing. Ken retired in 2019 after spending his entire career in information technology. He lives in the northwest portion of the state of Washington. He is also a member of the North American Unitarian Association Academy Advisory Board. This is Ken's second talk for the NAUA Academy. His first talk last September was entitled Left versus Left. What's happening here ain't entirely clear. This talk has been very popular and the most popular of the NAUA Academy programs to date. If you missed it, you may find a recording of it on the NAUA website on the Academy page. Actually, that recording has had over 1,500 views to date. Ken's title for the presentation today is entitled I Before We Except Overseas, Tracing the Roots of Our Multi-Century Identity Crisis. So it is my pleasure to welcome Ken back and to turn the program over to him. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen. And the first thing I have to do is get up to start sharing my screen here. So just a couple of things to go through to get that accomplished.
It looks good, Ken.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you for coming to see my talk. This talk is titled I Before We Except Overseas. The subtitle is Tracing the Roots of Our Multi-Century Identity Crisis, and my name is Ken Ing. Last year, I read a book that had a huge impact on me. It was titled 100 Years of Identity Crisis, written by a British professor of sociology named Frank Furedi. When I finished the book, I thought to myself, someday I should do a talk about this book so I can understand it. And then I remembered that there was another book that I read a couple of years ago. That book was titled Age of Anger by an author from India named Pankaj Mishna. Age of Anger can get us started on this story, and then 100 Years of Identity Crisis can pick up the thread kind of midway. And there's one more book that fits into the same narrative, and that's titled Cultural Evolution by Ronald Inglehart. And this book complements 100 Years of Identity Crisis, especially the last 60 of those 100 years. So those three books are the basis for this talk. This talk is going to be what I would call a grand narrative. This is the big picture from the 300-year level. There are obviously all kinds of angles to take when composing a narrative about a 300-year span, and this is just one way to think about it. But what I hope is that you'll listen to the ideas of these authors and then reflect on whether they make sense to you. Does this narrative have a ring of truth to it? And I want to show you the description of the talk that I supplied to the NAUA Academy when they scheduled the talk. It's a pretty good introduction to it. I wrote, most cultures of European descent cultivate individual identity more than other cultures of the world. We have to go back 60 or 100 or perhaps 300 years to find the roots of our contemporary debates over the role of identity in our society. I added, one intriguing theory is that this focus on individual identity has been intentional and has a distinct purpose. Now, some of you are probably trying to guess where this talk is going to take us, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat, it's not about consumerism. This is not about materialism. But I'll give you a hint. remember the title, I before we except overseas. Many parts of the world do not put the individual before the community, especially on the other side of the Pacific. Most Asian countries still put we before I. Most African countries still do likewise. This is a narrative that applies specifically to Western Europe and other countries whose culture is derived from or influenced by Western Europe. Have you ever been in a corn maze? This talk is going to end up feeling like that. You don't really know where it's headed. You can't remember where you just came from, and it keeps changing direction all the time. So I'm going to do something I don't usually do in my talks. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the talk while trying to preserve some of the mystery about how the story goes. I'll start the talk with the Age of Enlightenment, looking at how it affected individual people. Then I'll look at how the Enlightenment affected whole nations. Then I'll talk about how America dealt with the rapid pace of change in the 1800s. That leads into talking about how America and Western Europe reacted to World War I. The following section talks about the purpose of putting I before we. Then I'll talk about two different kinds of cultures, open cultures and conservative cultures. And then next, I'll look at the differences between generations since World War II. Then I'll retrace that same time period since World War II, looking specifically at the evolution of identity. At the end, I'll talk about recent changes in the role of identity in the Western world, as well as some very recent developments that signal possible future changes in the role of identity in our society. It may not be obvious what connects all these topics or why I felt the need to talk about things that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago. This talk is going to be like one of those connect the dots puzzle games. Hopefully, you'll end up seeing the connections, how the events of one era influence the events in a later era. We'll start with dot number 1. At the Age of Enlightenment, we start our story in the 1700s. According to Pankaj Mishna, the Enlightenment was when the Age of Anger began. In Wikipedia, it says, the central doctrines of the Enlightenment were individual liberty and religious tolerance in opposition to an absolute monarchy and the power of religious authorities. The key is to focus on what was discarded. The Enlightenment reduced the power of the kings and queens, as well as the authority of religion over people's lives, and that created holes in their lives that needed to be filled. One of the big ones was shared morals. These used to come from religion. Having a shared sense of what is moral, which is consistently carried forward from generation to generation, was a valuable mirror to hold up to oneself. It's important for people to be able to know if they're a good person or not. With religion being demoted, there was a big gap to fill. The Enlightenment also emphasized a different set of values, values like human happiness and the pursuit of knowledge. It's important for people to have a standard to aspire to, some shared sense of values that help them know that they're a valued person. The Enlightenment changed those standards. It's also important for people to have a shared identity, so it's clear who is considered to be us and who is them. Look at this map of religions before the Reformation. In Western Europe, for centuries, there was really only one religion. So the maneuverings of kings and queens is what established the boundaries between us and them. With the Reformation in the 1500s, the definition of us versus them shifted, pitting Catholics against Protestants, not to mention the Anglicans in England. But with the Enlightenment, being Catholic or Protestant no longer settled the question of who is us and who is them. So that is what was discarded, what gaps needed to be filled. Equally disorienting is what I would consider to be the unanticipated consequences of liberty. I call them the perils of modernity. When you live with all kinds of constraints on your freedom, you aren't completely responsible for your fate. It's not entirely your fault if you're unhappy or unsuccessful. After the Enlightenment, the burden was now on you. You have agency. The opportunity to become anything you desire ends up being the responsibility to take advantage of those opportunities. It's now your own fault if you and your family are miserable or you're a failure. One of the features of the Enlightenment, of modernity, is that change became a constant. In fact, as time went by, change kept speeding up. If you couldn't keep up with the changes, you could be left behind. One of the consequences of constant change is that your status is always in danger of being erased. Today, you're a hay farmer. Tomorrow, they might bring in hay from the neighboring state. Today, you're an expert at making buggy whips. Tomorrow, you might be obsolete. Let me recap some of the differences people had to grapple with. In the traditional culture, you found meaning in life by adhering to religious standards. Morals and values derived from religious writings, God's rules. When a culture embraced the Enlightenment, people needed to find meaning in secular standards. The philosophers were busy figuring out what morals and values we needed to follow, and people got meaning from their achievements in this life or from the esteem of their fellow man. In traditional culture, what was valued was essentially the denial of self. The Enlightenment flipped that 180 degrees. Now what was valued was a centering of self, and that's a big adjustment. In the traditional culture, your shared identity, the boundary between us and them, was based on religion and what kings or queens ruled over you. Under the Enlightenment, you really had a head start if you already had a shared identity as a nation. But if you had not already united, you were at a big disadvantage. And under traditional cultures, your physical and cultural security was provided by the monarchy. Under the Enlightenment, it was imperative to coalesce as a nation. Political unity with some critical mass was now critical for providing both your physical and cultural security. The book 100 Years of Identity Crisis points to one other characteristic of the Enlightenment as being the key. Whereas traditional cultures had a lot of continuity as one generation rolled into the next generation, the Enlightenment brought with it constant change. Adapting to constant change led to all kinds of change in the cultures of England and France, and especially in the United States. Let's think about how these changes affected people. In the new reality, post-Enlightenment, people were uncertain how to find meaning in their lives because the morals and the values were changing. Almost everyone felt insecure about where they stood and where they would stand tomorrow. I'm going to call this existential insecurity. I think this next challenge of the new reality is going to surprise you. I think this is perhaps the most destabilizing effect of the Enlightenment. It gave people hope. Giving people hope can lead to very good things, but it can also lead to bad things. Like it or not, the way the human psyche works, a lack of hope is actually a stabilizing thing. Without hope, you may not be happy, but you're probably not particularly unhappy because you don't expect any better. But light a spark of hope in a person, and yes, they could end up being much happier, but they could also end up being a lot unhappier. Hope leads to aspirations. You aspire to a better life or a more meaningful life. If you do what you think you're supposed to be doing, you will develop expectations that success and meaning will be your reward. When those expectations do not come true, you build up resentment. Or if you simply lack the opportunities or the means to compete in this chase for status and meaning and security, you'll build up resentment. If any particular individual struggles with the new reality, well, most of us would lament that, but not enough to be motivated to change the rules of the game very much. As we'll see in the next section, the consequences of hope are very different when it affects groups of people. This is the real issue. This is the reason Pankaj Mishna wrote the book Age of Anger. Now let's shift to talking about how the Enlightenment affected entire nations. Think back to those American history classes in high school and college. Who were the major players in the international scene? England, France, Holland, Spain. Who was conspicuously missing from the great game? Germany, Italy. Why? because they were not politically unified. Germany and Italy were still a loose collection of competing kingdoms. See how unified England and France and Spain appear on this map on the left? In contrast, the map on the right is a mess. So we have two narratives to track. The book 100 Years of Identity Crisis tracks the countries that jumped aboard the train of perpetual progress that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution set in motion. Eventually, that book focuses on the United States. The other narrative is from the book Age of Anger, which initially tracks Germany and Italy, two countries that were ill-prepared to adapt to the changes that the Enlightenment imposed on the people. Here's a map of Germany in the 1800s. It's really a mess politically. It was fragmented into 39 kingdoms. And here's Italy on the right. It's not much better. I count at least 7 kingdoms on this map. There had been a rapid explosion of the sharing of information, including the translation of books from one language to another. So everybody knew what was happening in England and France. Everybody was exposed to the philosophers that were made famous by the Enlightenment. Those ideals sparked hope. People, including whole groups of people, aspired to the benefits of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And that morphed from a spark of hope into an expectation. When these countries that were ill-suited to compete in this new era failed to meet those expectations, deep resentments were developed. Imagine that you work hard all day driving a delivery van, and every night you have to come home and see your billionaire neighbors who got rich from an internet startup flaunting their wealth. Having to face that every day will probably build up a lot of resentment. So you build a narrative in your mind. Your neighbors have the wrong values, the wrong priorities. They lead empty lives. They didn't deserve their success. This is a stupid game anyway. We're actually better than them in the ways that count. I think this is probably what Germans and Italians thought about the English and the French in the 1800s. There were a bunch of intellectual activists in Germany that wanted to forge a common identity, a common purpose. They wanted to light the spark for nationalism so Germany could be a force in the world. They emphasized their Germanic roots, their Germanic heritage, and they were creating a myth of a special people. Now, their efforts were not all that successful. What finally united Germany was Prussia taking over more of the northern states using military power. And then Prussia defeated Napoleon III of France in 1871, and the rest of the German Confederation states joined the bandwagon, and Germany was now a nation in 1871. Italy completed its unification at about the same time, but it was a rocky experience. Some of the earlier attempts by Italian intellectuals to rally the kingdoms of Italy into a unified political body also tried to create a myth of a special people. The one thing Italy shared with Germany was an ongoing sense of resentment of England and France. If resentment sums up the countries that missed the train of progress, anxiety is a word that captures life for people in the world of constant and accelerating change. Remember the perils of modernity? You're responsible for your fate. If you can't keep up, you'll be left behind. Your status is always in danger of being erased. But the whole nation also feels an anxiety because in this new era, everyone is competing against everyone else. As a nation, as a society, you need to be very adaptable to keep up with progress. So let's shift our focus to how America adapted to the rapid pace of change in the 1800s. Education. That was the key, education. People needed to have more skills. As many people as possible needed to be able to read and write. Most of all, people needed to be adaptable. All of these skills and character traits are best instilled in people when they're young. Over time, school assumed a higher priority, and young people would spend more years in school. But there was a weakness to this plan. It was slow. Young people were learning new skills, learning to be adaptable, but their parents were always stuck in the values of their generation. In the second half of the 1800s, there was a lot of frustration because progressives that wanted to keep moving society forward were obstructed by the set in their ways adults. So, to speed up progress, the educational system started to embrace the idea of socializing children into new sets of values. Schools started focusing on more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic. Furedi uses the word socializing to mean children acquiring the facility to function as competent and cooperative members of society. As a society, we were now delaying adulthood. For the first time, an adolescent had a distinct identity. The extra schooling, which extended through the adolescent years, provided a captive audience for socialization in the schools. Young people are the ideal soil to plant new ideas in because their minds are relatively malleable. The effect of this was a break with the past. New values had a chance of superseding the parents' values, values which were considered to be ill-suited for the current era. Now we get to the good stuff, or actually the bad stuff. Along comes World War I. We all know that World War I is a very complicated thing to get our arms around. On Germany's part, I think that lingering resentment of the West was a factor. An enduring feeling of national insecurity was a factor. And nationalism was definitely a factor. I haven't talked at all about Russia. What compelled Russia to get involved are a lot of the same sentiments. Resentment of being left out of the great game. Such a deep national insecurity that it actually had been planning a preemptive strike against Germany and Austria. And of course, an identification with their Russian heritage had carved out a rigid sense of us versus them. On the other side, the Allies had a dangerous web of alliances that were intended to guarantee security, but instead guaranteed that everybody would get pulled into this conflict. But more than anything, I think that the nature of World War I and how it played out was due to extreme overconfidence among the Western Allies. As we all know, what happened is that both sides kept throwing bodies at the problem, resulting in a stalemate that just chewed up millions of lives but got nowhere. It took the entry of the United States into the war, tipping the balance in the favor of the Allies, to convince Germany to agree to an armistice. So nothing I've said so far is all that surprising. Nothing I've said would rise to the level of a new way of thinking about our history. But now we really do get to the good stuff. Let's look at how America and the other Western European countries made some deliberate, proactive decisions in reaction to World War I. The reaction in the West was utter dismay that our culture had led us into World War I. We lost confidence in ourselves. Some of the intellectuals started thinking deeply about what is wrong with our culture that would let this happen. And they pointed a finger at three characteristics of our culture. The first problem was that we had a culture that valued conformity. The second is that our culture bred an authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality goes both ways. It breeds authoritarians, but more importantly, it breeds a willingness to follow authoritarians. The third problem is a belief that as a country, we can do no wrong, and overconfidence based on a belief that our country is special. The elite of that generation in Great Britain and France were judged to be incompetent, irresponsible, and frankly, self-deluded. So what causes this? What motivates people to conform and be willing to follow authoritarians? Well, it's our society's values. We must have put too much emphasis on duty and obedience to our superiors and courage and patriotism. This might seem like an impossible problem to solve. How can we change the standards by which we judge whether we're a good person? How do we find a different way of feeling valued? How do we change how people think about their identity? How do we find new routes in the search for meaning? How do we mitigate the existential insecurity of trying to find our place in the world? How do we set people up for success instead of most of the people having their hopes dashed and ending up resentful? This is a tall task indeed. I'll remind you of what the problem is: conformity, identifying with authoritarians, and nationalism. I'll give you a hint. The problem is that people were putting we before me. They were putting the collective before the individual. What we needed to do was put I before we. As you'll see in the next section, this was not a crazy idea. There's actually a scientific discipline that puts I before we. And no, I'm not talking about Darwinism. What I'm talking about is psychology. That was the answer, psychology. Psychology really hit its stride around this time. Sigmund Freud published his first two books at the turn of the century. Carl Jung started making a name for himself right around the time of World War I. Of course, it takes time for these giants in the field of psychology to enter the awareness of the general public. But don't you think the timing is very interesting? So, what does psychology do? It focuses on composing a stable sense of self. Its goal is happiness, or at least contentment. This focus on the self eventually flipped the standards. Instead of the goal being one of fitting in, the new goal was to stand out. It celebrates uniqueness, not conformity. It celebrates being your own person, not identifying so much with your country or your leaders. In the field of education, John Dewey had a huge influence. His emphasis was on preparing children to realize their full potential and then give them the ability to use those skills for the greater good. He also clearly felt that school itself is a social institution through which social reform can and should take place. Dewey was offering these ideas during the Progressive Era, which was before World War I broke out. In between World War I and World War II, more people started taking Dewey's ideas seriously. They wanted to use the schools even more aggressively. The experts started using the phrase social engineering instead of merely socializing. Then, after the disaster of World War II, where nationalism and the authoritative personality were manifested in spades, the majority of American society was ready to buy off on the idea of changing how we socialize children so as to avoid this disease of conformity and susceptibility to authoritarians. In particular, traditional parenting practices came under fire. The tendency to fall under the sway of authoritarians and to conform to societal expectations was blamed on the households being run in an authoritarian manner. The fathers demanded obedience, so the children learned obedience, and that normalized authoritarians. Fathers also modeled a masculinity that normalized aggression. Mothers demanded conformity to the behavior norms of the times, and that normalized judgment of those that were not conforming, and that could lead to the development of prejudices. Both were accused of modeling anti-democratic practices, supposedly conditioning people to accept anti-democratic behavior from their leaders. So, new paradigms for parenting were promoted. Note the date that Dr. Benjamin Spock first published his book, Baby and Child Care, 1946. Dr. Spock was writing his book during the middle of World War II, and he was providing guidance on how to raise children who would not exhibit the pathologies that result in world wars. The goal shifted from raising obedient children to raising well-adjusted children. Adolescence was recast as a time when a person was given the time and the space to compose a sense of self and identity. The mental health and self-concept of children were the feedback we looked for to tell whether the parent was doing right by the child or not. Now, make no mistake, this focus on self isn't the same as being self-centered. Individualism is not inherently selfish. It's about independence, about having a belief in your own personal agency, that you can use your own judgment to determine the difference between good and bad. Your judgment may align very well with the common consensus, or you may voluntarily defer to the collective judgment of others. But the key word there is voluntarily defer. Psychology weighed in on how to mold a well-adjusted child and what parental behaviors might obstruct that. It was comforting to parents that this was presented as a science based on reason and logic and evidence. You could trust the science. But notice what's happened. Parents now lack confidence in their role as parents. Are they on firm ground trying to pass on their values to their children? Values are not forever anymore. Are they on firm ground insisting on obedience from their children? The authority of adults is not an absolute anymore. Children are no longer expected to adapt to their parents' needs. The parents are expected to adapt to the needs of their children. So unwittingly, we now had established a pattern. It started with the Enlightenment when the morals and values dictated by religion were replaced and the authority of the kings and queens was replaced. The definition of morals and values was now in the hands of the people. And if they could be changed once, they could be changed again. At the beginning of the 20th century, the new generation is socialized in the schools to abandon the values of their parents to facilitate the changes promoted by the progressive movement. Then, after World War I, a new generation is socialized to repudiate the values of the preceding generation since it had made such a mess of things. Now, after World War II, we do it again, socializing a new generation of young people into a new orientation in life, a focus on their self, using the science of psychology. Every one of these generational changes was done for solid reasons, but of course, this was now the new normal. And this comes with its own set of problems. When values are being reinvented for every generation, the search for meaning is precarious. What it means to be a good person keeps changing. What values are esteemed shift. So what makes you a valued person keeps shifting. Your sense of identity is never solid. This might be the best place for me to explain why I titled this talk, I Before We Accept Overseas. I'm referring to Asia and Africa and Latin America. I visited Vietnam last year, and it's clear that their culture is a we before I culture. I was in Tanzania 4 years ago, and their culture feels like a we before I culture. So why is that? Frank Furedi's thesis is that it was World War I that made the difference. If you were a major player in World War I, you had to do some soul searching about how things got so out of hand. And then those same countries saw things get out of hand a second time. The other cultures in the world did not have that same wake-up call. But then again, the other cultures in the world had not replaced their religious values with secular values. This is a good place to introduce the idea of open versus conservative cultures. Now it's time to pull in the third book, Cultural Evolution by Ronald Inglehart. He has an interesting theory about cultures. He thinks of cultures as either being open cultures or conservative cultures. Conservative cultures are focused on their physical safety and their economic safety. This makes them wary of outsiders. There are strong pressures to conform to group norms, and maintaining order is a high priority. In this sense of being conservative, people want stability and predictability. In open cultures, people are more comfortable with everyone being free to choose how to live their lives. They're comfortable with tolerating freedom of expression for a wider range of points of view. And they're comfortable with wide participation in decision-making processes. Note how these map to freedom, reason and tolerance, and democracy. So what causes cultures to be either open or conservative? Inglehart thinks that what this comes down to is how secure do people feel? If people feel secure, they are open to new things. If people are not feeling secure, then stability and the predictability tradition are preferred. Moreover, Inglehart thinks that this determination, whether a group of people feel secure or not, is based on their formative years when they're young. If you grow up feeling insecure, you will always feel insecure. If you grow up feeling reasonably secure and you're in the middle of good times, then you tend to be more open. During more anxious times, you may temporarily revert to being more conservative, but you can fairly quickly rebound back into feeling secure and being more open if things get better. So here's how this theory about cultural evolution fits into this narrative I've been describing. Inglehart postulates that the generation that grew up in the United States after World War II is the first generation that took survival for granted. The social safety net put in place during the Depression helped a lot, as it reduced a fear of becoming destitute and not being able to feed oneself. We have not had a war that directly involved the major powers since World War II. That helps make people feel secure. The advent of vaccines greatly reduced the fear of disease. Disease is another thing that makes us wary of outsiders. And of course, with most of the rest of the world experiencing either physical devastation during the war or going broke fighting the war, the United States experienced a generation of exceptional economic growth and a general increase in prosperity after World War II. Let's look at the changes in values and culture between each generation after World War II. So we have a convergence of trends here. The thesis of 100 Years of Identity Crisis is that the United States intentionally shifted the culture to focus on the individual instead of the collective to avoid another world war. And it just so happened that the baby boomers were the first generation that did grow up feeling secure enough that they were free to make that shift, to make the pursuit of personal happiness and the cultivation of the esteem of others the object of their search for meaning. Here's the new dynamic of generational change. Values change as generations change. Questioning the norms of the prior generation is now normal. The individual is prioritized ahead of the collective. The focus is on the psychological well-being of individuals. The educational system utilizes social engineering to socialize children in the new norms and values, intentionally bypassing the parents, so as to not be stuck with old, obsolete values. This is the formula that has kept us out of another world war for 80 years. Now I want to look at how this has played out in those 80 years. That takes us to the 1960s. We can see this dynamic at its most extreme in the 60s. New values, new norms, me before we, individual psychological well-being. The colleges were the epicenter of this social revolution, even if they didn't want to be. The narrative seems to fall apart when it comes to the children of the baby boomers, but what I think happened is that the boomers had their own generation change. They threw aside their own values from the 60s. One practice the boomers adopted when they became parents was to be extremely involved in their kids' lives. They adopted a value that I would call safetyism. The parents took it upon themselves to take responsibility for keeping their children physically safe. When it came to the next generation, the millennials, this value of safetyism was extended to parents feeling responsible for their children's emotional and psychological well-being. This began the era of everybody gets a trophy. This began the era of great inflation. Having everyone feel good about themselves kind of took over as the goal. One other development in this era deserves mentioning. How we aligned ourselves politically changed. Up to the 90s, the two political parties in the United States were roughly divided by socioeconomic class. Starting in the 90s, party affiliation shifted to be based on values, not class. This might help explain why right now we are in the middle of a culture war, not a clash between the haves and the have-nots. Now I'm going to retrace those same 80 years since World War II, looking specifically at the evolution of individual identity since psychology became our new religion. At first, the building of a sense of self, a well-adjusted individual identity, was about individual achievement. This was considered to be a great advance in our culture, to center our society around merit. Individual achievement was seen as the way to build a solid and durable sense of self. When we got to the 60s, young people were resisting what some people called the rat race. Young people seemed to try to find meaning in life by living life to its fullest, living a life with a lot of variety, having peak experiences, that kind of thing. I'm going to quote a whole paragraph out of the book, 100 Years of Identity Crisis. Furedi likes to use long sentences, but I think he explains how his theory applies to the 1960s really well. On page 193, it says, the generational conflict of the 1960s served as a conduit for a thoroughgoing process of cultural realignment. Suddenly, the trends discussed in the previous chapters, loss of the sense of the past and of adult authority, the detachment of society from its traditions, the idealization of nonconformism, the displacement of a moral narrative by a psychological one, socialization through validation, they all gathered pace. See, I told you like to use long sentences. And it goes on to say, the cultural changes that had been set in motion decades previously unexpectedly acquired sufficient power and assertiveness to self-consciously declare itself a counterculture. The discovery and institutionalization of adolescence in the 19th century was consummated in the 1960s. In the 1980s, our society recommitted to valuing achievement and merit. Remember the terms yuppies and beamers? How about the decade of greed? It was still a time of me before we, and the happiness of the individual was still the goal. A big difference between the 50s and the 80s is the embrace of consumerism and materialism in the 80s. Now I want to remind you that what I'm telling you what the perspectives of the writers of the books are. I do translate their ideas into my own words, so I do use the pronoun I a lot, but I'm trying to stay true to the theses in these books. As we get closer to the current day in this narrative, this is going to hit closer to home. It can be uncomfortable hearing social scientists analyze what your motivations are, even if they are talking about the overall trends in our culture. The point of this talk is to look at things from a new point of view. Maybe this will ring true for you, maybe it won't. Picking up the story, I think the 90s is when we start to acknowledge that the pursuit of achievement and status was being played on an uneven playing field. For some people, the ladder was harder to climb than it was for others through no fault of their own. The standards could be unfair. So I think that historically marginalized people started to insist that they should be valued and respected irrespective of their achievements. A way of describing this is that people started expecting to be validated and affirmed just the way they were, with no standards being applied to judge them. Standards are subjective and often unfair to expect people to meet given their circumstances in life. The problem is that this is ultimately unsatisfying. If almost half of the grades are now A's and only 22% of grades are C or below, getting an A adds no meaning to your life. Being unconditionally validated or unconditionally affirmed does not provide meaning to your life. We have stripped away a lot of the standards whereby people can feel secure that they are a good person and that they are valued. Cultivating an identity based on being unique has no staying power. You have to continually recreate your identity to keep demonstrating that you're special because there are no fixed criteria you can point to. So what was the next step? Has this search for our identity hit a dead end? No, there was another route to take. If you as an individual struggle to find an available way to be unique and worthy of respect, the alternative is to identify with a group that is unique and worthy of respect, simply due to the nature of the group. In particular, being a member of a historically marginalized identity group now automatically confers on you some status in our society. And the theory is that this is where the elevation of the importance of identity groups came from. Certain identity groups are unique and worthy of respect specifically because they have been at a disadvantage in the pursuit of achievement and power. That's why we call them historically marginalized identity groups. Notice how the notion of identity has evolved. Before the 1950s, what a person tried to do was fit in to the dominant groupings. They wanted to belong to the larger group. If you asked, who is us? The people from the greatest generation and the silent generation would say, we are Americans. The baby boomers and their children tried to stand out as individuals. Everybody was trying to differentiate themselves, to be their own person. They would probably say that us is people their own age. Think about this. For the boomers among us, can you imagine your parents or grandparents going to the gym every day after work? They just didn't seem to focus on themselves the same way boomers and Gen X did. The millennials and Gen Z combine standing out and fitting in. They work even harder at being unique than boomers and Gen X, but at the same time, strongly identify with subgroups based on immutable characteristics like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender. I want to talk a little bit more about how these recent changes in the role of identity are influencing our culture. The transformation we're in the middle of seems to be following the dynamics of generational change. It's a transition that aims to incorporate these new conceptions of identity. We're seeing some redefining of what our values are, so they align with the revised conceptions of identity. I've already mentioned a couple of these. The expectation of validation and affirmation, as well as assigning a greater importance to what identity groups people belong to. The norms of prior generations are being challenged. For instance, making judgments between good and bad is incompatible with validation and affirmation. Language is another place where norms are contested. Expanding the lexicon of politically incorrect words is often how identity groups exercise their cultural power. It's not really me before we, but instead it's about the small we of identity groups before the larger we of the broader society. I think it's clear that individual psychological well-being is a very high priority. This has gotten to the point where being disagreed with is considered to be harmful. That takes psychological well-being to a whole new level. The higher education system is being leveraged to facilitate this cultural revolution. These new conceptions of identity started in the universities. Concepts like microaggressions, safe spaces, and cultural appropriation became part of the college culture. As these young people move into positions of influence in our institutions, they bring this increased focus on identity with them. I think it's clear that these changes are intended to affect how you demonstrate that you are a good person. It affects what it takes to be a valued person. This is very disorienting for some of us from the older generations. Frank Furedi argues that these changes are not going to accomplish what the young people think they will. Let's read from the book 100 Years of Identity Crisis again. This time Furedi is explaining how his theory applies to our current situation. On page 211, the book says, the 60s generation assumed that the right to validation was an integral element of social justice. What followed was a ceaseless demand for the recognition of self-worth and identity. Once identity acquires the form of right, rather than as a state to be achieved through self-cultivation or action or work, it acquires a passive form. As history professor Christopher Lasch pointed out in his 1979 book, The Cult of Narcissism, today men seek the kind of approval that applauds not their actions, but their attributes. Approval thus becomes an act of affirmation of self rather than an evaluation of individual achievement. Its corollary is that the refusal to affirm can constitute an act of psychological harm. Then on page 212, Furedi says, A real recognition of the individual requires that choices be made between knowledge and opinion and contributions that are worth esteeming and those that are not. Both the granting and the demand for universal esteem serve to transform recognition into an empty ritual. Such formulaic reassurance cannot meet the existential quest for recognition. Now I want to bring in the perspective of the book Cultural Evolution again. I want to look at what's been happening in Middle America. I'm going to make some broad generalizations here. Jobs where you produce goods, like manufacturing, provide security and add meaning to people's lives. But there's no job growth in that sector. There hasn't been for many decades. Service sector jobs provide less security and are not as fulfilling, and that is where a lot of the new jobs have come from. Middle America has faced many headwinds over the decades. Automation in the 60s, offshoring in the 70s, a shift to finance in the 80s, computerization in the 90s, outsourcing in the aughts, the shift to contract labor, the so-called gig economy in the last decade. All of these trends lead to less security and fewer jobs that can give people a sense of meaning in their lives. They also have created a large wealth gap in the United States. In the 1980s, the bottom 90% held 37% of the wealth. One generation later, it was down to just 23%. The top 1% held 25% of the wealth in the 80s. As of 2012, the top 1% had 42% of the wealth. The winners in this wealth transfer are not the people who live in Middle America. Here's the political map of the US. Democrats in blue, Republicans in red. Those red areas are the ones hardest hit by automation in manufacturing, offshoring, computerization, and outsourcing. I like the symbolism of the color red because you can almost feel the resentment building up in most of the United States. This hits on all of those challenges of coping with modernity, a struggle to find meaning, existential insecurity, resentment. Now we have a debilitating culture war going on in the US. One reason is because Middle America does not have the option of finding meaning by associating with identity groups. It's kind of the opposite. The resentments of Middle America are many. Nobody is validating them. Nobody is affirming them. Their values are disrespected by the elites on both coasts. Their identity groups are actually disrespected in some corners of the United States. All of this leads to deep resentments in Middle America. In 2016, Arlie Hochschild wrote a book that gave voice to some of these resentments. It's titled Strangers in Their Own Land. She has an analogy in the book that I think is very revealing. She asks us to imagine that we are patiently standing in the middle of a long line, stretching towards the horizon where the American dream awaits. But as you wait, you see people cutting in line ahead of you. That's the end of the quote from her book. I think it's easy to see why the United States is embroiled in a culture war. If your values, if your culture, if your very identity is no longer respected, there's naturally going to be a lot of pushback. I want to take us on one more digression, another angle not covered by our two main books. But before I do, I think it would be appropriate to show you how each of these two authors summarized their thoughts. We didn't follow the story Pankaj Mishna tells in Age of Anger beyond World War I. He is from India, so the unresolved resentments of peoples and nations outside of Western Europe are much more relevant to him. His prognosis is pretty bleak, but we need to listen carefully to his warnings. At the end of his book, he says, "It has become impossible to deny the great chasm between an elite that seizes modernity's choicest fruits while disdaining older truths and the uprooted masses who, on finding themselves cheated of those same fruits, recoil into cultural supremacism, populism, and rancorous brutality." And his final sentence says, "This underscores the need for some truly transformative thinking, both about the self and the world." I think it's accurate to say that he doesn't really have a solution to offer, but that doesn't mean his diagnosis of the problem is not worthy of our consideration. His thesis is that the corrosive effect of resentment is a clear and present danger to stability in the world. Our other author, Frank Furedi, does have a recommendation for the Western cultures. His last paragraph says, it's not possible to retrace our steps and retrieve what we left behind, but it is possible to take ourselves more seriously. We need to teach ourselves that the identity that really matters is the one that is the outcome of our achievement through work and action. This can all begin by socializing and educating the young for independence rather than training them to become recipients of validation. In other words, Furedi seems to want to turn back the clock, perhaps to the 1980s, perhaps even to the 1950s. You might very well disagree with his recommendation and conclude that, well, he sounds like an old-style conservative to me. That may be so, but I still think his diagnosis of what ails our society is worthy of our consideration. In a minute, I'll talk about a very recent movement that could lead to future changes in the role of identity in our society. But first, I wanted to reconnect all of the dots for you to remind you of how we got here. I started out by talking about how the Age of Enlightenment affected people, having the source of morals and values and collective identity change made it very challenging for individuals to find security and meaning in life. The Enlightenment affected whole nations. If you jumped on the train of progress, it led to the anxiety of constant change. If you missed the train, it led to deep resentment and efforts to find other ways to bind together as a nation. I talked about how America adapted to rapid change in the 1800s by emphasizing education. Education provides the means for socializing children into new values, discarding their parents' values. This could speed up change. World War I led to a crisis of confidence in America and Western Europe. We had to do some soul searching about how values like duty, obedience to your superiors, courage, and patriotism had led to such a disaster. We were looking for ways to reduce the tendency towards conformity and identifying with authoritarians and nationalism. World War II was an even worse disaster, so the Western world turned to psychology to shift the focus to the individual instead of the collective. Authoritarian households, stressing obedience and conformity, were blamed for our problems. So norms for parenting were changed. Schools engaged in social engineering to reinforce new values and norms. Coincidentally, the baby boomer generation was the first generation that could take its physical security for granted, so this shift to a focus on the self instead of the collective could be pursued. Remember, individualism is not inherently selfish. The goal was to develop a stable sense of self, independence, and a sense of personal agency. Now we were in a repeating pattern. Almost every generation since World War II had adopted their own set of values. It's now seen as normal to toss aside the values and norms of your parents and grandparents. Over those same 80 years, the focus on the self and on finding an identity had evolved. The initial goals of achievement based on merit have morphed into expecting to be validated and affirmed just the way you are. I just finished talking about individuals now accruing respect and status by being members of historically marginalized identity groups. We appear to be in the middle of an attempt to replace the values and norms of the baby boomer and Gen X generations. Understandably, there's been pushback from Middle America, and this is part of what our current culture war is about. Now, in the next section, the final section, I'll talk about a very recent movement that could lead to further changes in the role of identity in our society in the near future. I had actually finished with a draft of this talk when it occurred to me, wait, there's a piece to this narrative that the book 100 Years of Identity Crisis doesn't even talk about. Furedi is focused on individuals. When he talks about values, he's mostly talking about personal values. But there's other kinds of values. Let's call them social values. Values that reflect how we relate to each other. both as individuals and as groups. Remember, if values can change over and over again, what's to say that any values are truly carved in stone? There's a new movement that's getting some traction that has big ambitions. It rejects what we would call Enlightenment values. It rejects reason and logic and due process because those values assume that we can be making objective judgments and determinations about the world. This movement asserts that objectivity is not possible. This movement questions many aspects of Western culture. For instance, it rejects merit as a standard. This movement seeks to invert the power dynamics in Western society, elevating the power of non-dominant identity groups over dominant identity groups. The movement uses a lens of oppressor versus oppressed. If you're a member of a dominant identity group, you are implicitly an oppressor. If you are a member of a non-dominant identity group, you are considered to be oppressed. The movement rejects the decades-long goal of providing equal opportunities for all individuals. Instead, it asserts that success should be measured by the material well-being of entire identity groups. This is a call for a goal of equal outcomes, not just equal opportunities. Finally, many social commentators are saying that our public education system are socializing kids to think in terms of identity group membership at younger and younger ages. Schools are also reportedly starting to socialize young children to use an oppressor versus oppressed lens to understand their world. This lens is applied to reassess history, as well as assess our current society. There's a theme uniting all of these threads in the new movement. The individual is invisible. It's all about identity groups. Individual character and individual agency are deemed to be irrelevant. The individual is indistinguishable from their immutable characteristics. This puts we before me again. It promotes the value of conformity and encourages groupthink. Remember when I asked if the search for identity had hit a dead end and that belonging to a marginalized group could confer status upon a person? Well, what if you were part of the majority? This is an alternative for you. Supporting this ideology is itself a form of identity. It does require something of you, though. If you belong to the dominant identity groups, your role is to relinquish your personal cultural power and political power. So in a way, this brings back the old religious virtue of denial of self. In short, support for this movement is a way to find extra meaning in your life. That's one thing that gives this movement more influence and momentum than one might expect. We seem to have historical amnesia. We've forgotten what happened a century ago when we expected conformity and when we put the collective ahead of the individual. We seem to have no understanding of how making the individual invisible has so often led to extreme abuses of power in other countries. Our liberal tradition is based on freedom, reason, and tolerance. These values have survived every generational transition for 300 years. This movement to replace the Enlightenment values seems to have some momentum. The question we are faced with is whether we have the confidence to defend these values. Are we willing to stand up for the values of freedom and reason, and especially tolerance? I want to thank you for being willing to listen to these interesting yet somewhat uncomfortable theories about the roots of our contemporary debates over the role of identity in our society. And I really look forward to hearing your comments and questions in the Q&A that comes next. As a reminder, the Q&A portion of the program will not be recorded.